I held off on this coverage because I was trying to wrap my head around the best way to express what was bothering me. We in crypto, anybody who's in crypto, whether you're new to it or you're not, there's certain things that attract our attention, right? About a cryptocurrency. That may be something about their messaging, could be something about their utility, could be simply their supply and the potential for profit. I think everybody is ultimately profit driven at some level. But, you know, I'm starting to notice a pattern. In one of my old episodes, which you can find on cryptotalkradio.net, and subscribe to the podcast because that's where you're going to find this good stuff. In one of my very old episodes, I was talking about supply, token supply, how much inventory this token has, and the potential for profit over time. And of course, there's a couple of things we know. We know that scarcity plays a very strong contributing factor into the potential success of a token project, right? We know that there's the opportunity for us to make money because of the scarcity of a project. But that's only one dimension, right? We also know that volume matters. We know that the holder count matters. We know that the price movement is influenced by all these different things. But with supply, we also saw that tokens like SHIB, Shiba Inu, have an unreasonable amount of tokens and just happen to benefit from this idiot burning half of it, right? And that was a drop in the pan, once in a lifetime shot that's never going to be replicated, I would argue. So they benefited from something, but even with that, and even with their transactional burns, they're not going to get significantly higher than they are for a long time, unless they do a much more significant burn, which gets me thinking. Supply of the token at the time, I've assumed that people were getting smart about it and they saw what was happening with SHIB and they got smarter and said, you know what, we need to do something better. We can't keep doing this egregious amounts of tokens. We got to do something smarter and better. So let's just go a better way about this. And I assumed that we were going to see a decrease in the amount of token supply. And if you listen to any of my recent episodes, whether YouTube or podcast, you would have heard that my sweet spot number personally is no greater than 200 trillion tokens. Why 200 trillion? 200 trillion is kind of the best. If you think about the gimmicks that people do with token developers, it's always the same thing. There's an egregiously high supply. Then they allegedly, quote, burn half of it. I'll get back to that. In order to constrain the inventory or make it seem like there's a less supply than there really is. And to kind of spike up the price ever slightly so that you're not starting from scratch square. Then you start seeing tokens come out with the Quadrillions of the world, the Quintillions of the world, and most egregiously, the Sextillions of the world. And it gets worse and worse, the complete opposite of what I expected. Whereas if you start with an inventory that's not that bad, so if I took one that had 1 quadrillion tokens and I burned half of it, so there's 500 trillion available to be in circulation. That's not as hard to consume, but it takes time. SHIB ultimately is left with like 400, just shy of 500 trillion, I believe, tokens that it has to deal with. And they've done the best they can, but look how long that took. I mean, it took them years to get to the point where we saw any significant price movement. That means that somebody would have had to buy in, and this happened at a very early stage. And as the thing drops zeros, then they're able to become a millionaire and cash out. But most people today are impatient and they don't want to wait years for that to happen. And it's harder now to get the holders to come in and harder to get the holders to stay because you lack utility. Even when you do have utility, if your utility sucks compared to the competition, it's hard for you to stand out in a crowd. So to me, 200 trillion struck a good balance between a high enough inventory that we can drop some zeros, but not so high as to immediately cause whales, millionaire whales, to dump on it and never come back, but still opportunity for growth, reasonable, healthy growth, and no real need to burn half the supply. You don't need to do it because it's low enough that you should be able to eat that up in about a year's time, assuming everything's good with the community, because I believe that the community is going to be your strongest motivating factor for people to buy in that dude. I believe that. I don't believe it's the marketing necessarily as number one. Is it important? Yes, but I think community is number one on the list. So if we grant that community is the strongest motivator, and we can build strong community. And when I say strong community, I'm not talking telescam. I'm talking that you're using all forms of community equally, whether that's Twitter, unfortunately, Facebook, unfortunately, even Instagram to some degree, although it's not visual or whatever, to Reddit, to Discord, to YouTube. You're using as many different outlets to find people. One thing I had to learn with basic cryptonomics that I hadn't appreciated when I launched, but I appreciate now, is that the hard truth is that search engines are your greatest asset when you want to make people aware and find you, organically stumble upon you. Search engines are going to be your best friend. Telescam doesn't understand search engine. That's why that's one reason of many I don't support it. Discord doesn't fully support search engine. So now you talk about forums and outlets that do support it, which would be your YouTubes of the world, which would be your Reddits of the world, which would be your Twitters of the world, your Facebooks of the world, and so on. But you can use all of them because there are people that are on each one of those and they prefer that as their platform of choice over something else. So you have to use all of these together in order to create the community. It's not just one place that you force them to, which is what certain tokens have done. And you've heard me call them out for that, what I felt was a bad decision. It's you have to collectively treat them as a community together. Now, for the tokens that suck at it, and there are quite a few, they put gimmicks in front of it. If you listen to the episode with Bleaves, which is not on YouTube, you need to go to cryptotalkradio.net for the good stuff. If you listen to the episode with Bleaves, he even calls out that a lot of these things we see on tokens today are basically gimmicks. They're basically tricks to try to convince people to buy in. And then there's other reasons why those tricks make sense when we think about holder counts. Well, the 200 trillion, and you don't put the half burn because you don't need to, forces you to grow strong and organic, and hopefully you've got good utility, and it forces you to have a strong community overall that helps you broadcast why to buy in it. But they also have to have you have to have their trust, and you have to have their long-term investment bought in. Mathematically speaking, just basic math, and you can pull out a calculator and do this yourself. It's easier, I think, to get, say, 100,000 holders to invest in a project that has a 200 trillion supply and still benefit everybody there than it is to do what I'm seeing more and more of, and it drives me nuts. And this is the summary of my rant here, which is that they'll put a high supply because they're banking on something I covered before as the psychological effect of the, trillions and trillions and billions of tokens. They're actually using that now as a marketing strategy. And so what we see is the rise of tokens that have literally 69 sextillion tokens. Some have 420 sextillion tokens. It's an excessive amount of tokens. The people buy in. The vast majority don't spend a lot because it's like, oh, I can put $20 in this thing and I hold quadrillions of tokens. That's pretty cool. It's a psychological trick. It's a trap in a way. Because no matter what you do, that token in its current supply will never make you super wealthy. You would have to invest a significant amount of money into it and then wait for people to buy in. And then when you dump, you're harming the project because nobody else has bought into that degree. So it's never able to create the liquidity to support that kind of dump and prevent against it. And they may have anti-whale to boot. And people see this, and then the big whales don't necessarily buy in. I'm not telling you what to buy or not. I'm sharing my personal opinion that I think once you get into the sextillions of tokens, you've lost the plot. I think it's way too much. I think quintillion is too much. And I say that, I know Satama's in the quintillion. I think that's part of the reason that it's not just the sentiment, that's a part of it, but I think also the quintillion hurts its ability to grow without excessive holder increase. SHIB, which I'm pretty sure hit the quintillion mark in its total when it launched, SHIB is well over 1.5 million, I'm pretty sure. And even it's having a hard time to grow past a certain point. Like it hits a law of diminishing returns. which I attribute personally to the supply being at a point that you're not able to get to that. Now, if you look at something else like Doge, which technically has an unlimited inventory because new tokens are minted on a regular basis, you have to start thinking, how is it possible then that Doge is able to crack a penny with an unlimited, virtually unlimited inventory, but SHIB can't even get close to it and it has constrained inventory? And it's because the way Doge did theirs, it didn't start with a super high inventory. It grows as people buy in, but the transactions don't stop. People are constantly buying and selling it. It's already at a point of capacity of awareness. So it's got the volume to support the price where it's at and keep it pretty steady, even when whales dump on it. It's still able to stay over 10 cents. That means that there's something to that. There's something to the constrained inventory, even if you have growth, as opposed to the super high, egregious high inventory, even though you don't, do or don't do burns. So it almost feels like many tokens are doing it backwards. We start with a super high inventory to bank on the psychological effect of billions and billions and trillions. And we're not thinking it deeper that maybe Doge had it right all along as the best possible way to do it, which is to create a slightly inflationary process. And over time, it grows as the holder counts grow. I would even take it a step further if possible. And anybody who's a token dev listening, you can steal the idea, because it just occurred that perhaps the cleanest way to do something like this is, again, the 200 trillion or even smaller, but maybe 100 trillion at the lowest. I wouldn't go into the billions. I think that's too low. But let's say 100 trillion, 200 trillion. Then once the contract sees that the holder count hits a certain threshold, percentage threshold, according to the amount of supply that's the gap between total and circulating, then it says, okay, we're going to auto mint, not by human, but auto mint this many tokens in order to keep ahead of it, and just keep doing that and keep doing that, but never so much that it damages the price, so that it's a constant, steady growth. Because that's the opposite of what we're doing. What we're doing now in mechanics is super high inventory, initial burn, auto burn, reflections, buyback and liquefy, which I'm cool with that mechanic by itself, and farm staking and all these other gimmicks that are kind of hats on a hat. And they look good on the surface, but truly, Libero to date, and to a lesser degree Fino, are the only ones that seem to have been able to mitigate loss of value, but then they're high risk assets by their very nature. They're constrained, number one, but they're also high risk assets. You simply don't know. There's no way they can sustain the level of growth long term, and you don't know what's going to happen when. So they're high risk by design. So I don't know if that's the right answer either, but having something that's in the hundreds of trillions that is smart enough to understand the holder count going up and is able to mint automatically to keep a pace so that it's always ahead for new buyers, or even better, it knows how to mint based on a request to buy when the supply is at a point where doing so would damage the contract otherwise. Some way to get that structure Doge has and tweak it to where it's still appealing to people buying in by way of the number of zeros it can drop, but it's always in a state of growth because of the way the contract's built to keep ahead of it. And I'm throwing this out there, and I don't want to say protest because that's not fair, but I'm throwing this out there in response, I guess, to the rise of the sextillions of tokens and the quintillions of tokens and the quadrillions of tokens, to say the vast majority of you have not worked. And while they have their pumps because of the newness factor, many of them don't sustain. They don't last long term, or they lose steam, or they devolve into a pump and dump situation. And nobody wants to see that either. And I don't know what it would take to get away from that, to get back to where the tokens remain in a healthy state long term. I will say toxicity plays part of a factor. The more that tokens use shillers, true shillers, I think it creates a toxic community. And as I said, community is number one. So that may be a factor in why they're not able to sustain as well. But I also think there's ways we can think of getting more creative about the tokenomics to where it can grow with the holders in a healthy way so that you don't need to start out with an egregious large inventory. Then figuring out how to manage the psychological of the number of tokens you have, which Rebase tried to, but Rebase has its own issues. That's why I go back to Pheno and Libero in the sense that though they are Rebase tokens, they don't behave like your traditional Rebase, you know. So I don't know what the like Ampleforth. So I don't know what the clean answer is. I'm not putting an answer. I'm putting thoughts out to consider how can we convince cryptocurrencies not to leap back to the sextillions and the quintillions and the quadrillions anymore, because I think that those are going to have a harder time succeeding as time goes by. I think people are starting to get, frankly, tired of them, but the psychological is still there for newer investors, and that's harmful because as we get more people in, as this thing matures, we're damaging sentiment of crypto overall when we see that many of those don't pan out, even when the devs don't do anything wrong, even when there's nothing wrong really with the project, but it's held back because we banked on the psychological. And then we tack gimmicks, NFTs and auto burns and swaps and all these gimmicks to try to deal with it. This was mostly inspired by tokens like Shirio, which I've covered Shirio before. I felt like the supply is just too dang much. Kishimoto, I feel the supply is too dang much. Shaman King, I feel the supply is too dang much. Dozilla, I feel the supply is too dang much. Dozilla was the real inspiration behind this because nobody knows with that one. It might be a dang scam. For all we know, the thing is, it doesn't matter because nobody's investing a lot of money in it. So even if it was a scam, you really lose nothing. But is that the kind of world we want in cryptocurrency? Is a bunch of tokens that spin up that are essentially low risk by virtue of how many tokens you get, but then they're high risk if you did go all in with a lot of money because they could yank on you on your psychological impact of this many tokens. Is that the kind of world of crypto that we want? Is that all these projects, they just throw out inventories that are meaningless and none of them refine their inventory to minimize how many gimmicks you need? I'm actually okay with a reflection mechanic, but I think having a high inventory with the reflection mechanic nullifies, they cut themselves off, cancel each other out. If you have a mostly constrained inventory and then you combine that with a decent reflection mechanic, I think it's the best possible balance you can have. The token we were going to have on the show, I think, has the perfect synergy of mechanics and inventory, which is why I wanted to talk to them and why their investor wanted them to talk to me, because the things that hold them back, I believe, are easily fixed. So if anybody spins up another token and they want to kind of pick my brain on what I'm thinking based on having, because I invest in various tokens just to do this coverage, but also at curiosity factor. I want to see how they different play out and how the communities grow. And I watch sentiment and I watch all these things. So I've experienced and exposure with a lot of different tokenomics that I think there's a good balance between them all that we can strike to create stronger crypto and try to get back to what Mr. Segala was advocating, which is to get back to the reason that we tried to get in this in the first place and we failed, but that they're worth owning. Like, that's the key. Are we creating tokens that are worth owning, or are we creating tokens that are just there to make you some cash and move? As I said with Libero, they straight tell you, we're here to make you money. Cool, that's your mission and I hold you to it. But perhaps we need tokens that actually want to be held. They actually want to be valued. They actually want to be highly regarded. Right now, all that we can say fit that would be Bitcoin, Ethereum, probably Avalanche, I'll give them that, AVAX, and a select few other ones, Doge, but not very many. There's not very many that you feel like this is worth holding, not just from a fiat value, but the way that it's built and the way that it's designed, that it has intrinsic value beyond quick cash grab. I believe it starts with inventory. I believe, as far as the token, I believe it starts with community as it pertains to reputation and value and increasing holders. So it's taking both together, but without the community, which you can build a community off anything, we see that, but without the community, they're not going to buy in. And if you have a constrained inventory, you don't need as many. If you have a significant inventory, you need way more than I think you're ever going to get anymore. And perhaps there's so many tokens that just think they can be the next SHIB, Shiba Inu, that everybody thinks they can pull a 1.5 million like they did. Most of the popular ones out there, they're not even close. We're being impressed by the 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000, and those are small numbers, but they're not 1.5 million. And it took SHIB years to get to that count, and it doesn't do anything. So when you have tokens that do a lot and they can't crack that egg, it tells me personally, we got a lot of work to do to restore crypto to the greatness that I think many of us feel that it could and should be. I just personally don't support the rise of excessive inventory because I think it dilutes the brand, the crypto brand. I think it dilutes the product and makes people disillusioned, and they don't want to trust because they think you're doing it to take their money. I'm not even talking about scam. I'm talking about just you're investing in something that really has no end game in sight. Something to think about. And any token that listens, any dev that listens, and you have a token that has extensive inventory, I would love to speak to any of these that have those high inventories to talk about burns, because that's a totally different episode, because many of them seem to be resistant to doing significant burns. And we like to know why. We like to understand it so that people in the business, people out listening, can understand it.